going to get this meeting underway. Representative Rowe, if you can lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Absolutely. Flag is behind us.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. I'm going to start with you again, Representative Rowe. The members could briefly introduce themselves, and we'll go from there.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Representative David Rowe from the 85th Legislative District, just south of here, including Union, Snyder, Juniata, and Mifflin counties.
Representative Flick from the 83rd District, which is the Williamsport area down through Union County. Thank you.
Clinell, 68th Legislative District, all of Tioga and about half of Bradford County. Welcome.
Josh Kale, 15th Legislative District, Beaver, Washington counties.
Representative Joanne Stair from the 107th, and that's Schuylkill and Northumberland counties.
Representative Mike Stender. I have Northumberland County and all of Montour County.
We also have Representative Eric Nelson joining us online. Representative Nelson, you know the drill. Keep your computer muted unless you have a question. Raise your hand figuratively, and we will be happy to have you ask your question. Representative Alette, I feel like this area is becoming my second home. I was just here a couple weeks ago when a coyote shot me. But
it's quite a story.
If you'd like to give brief opening remarks, and we'll get this hearing underway.
Thank you, and thank you to Three Springs for your hospitality and hosting us here today. When you think of Three Springs, one of the words is hospitality, so thank you so much for allowing us to be here today to cover this very sensitive topic today. Also want to thank all the members and the chairman for coming out. I know it's a long ways, and the testifiers for the time and energy that you put in ahead of time to be here today to present to us. Thank you for that. Everybody who was able to make it, we appreciate you taking the time. You may have thought you were in the middle of nowhere. It's actually just down the road a little further. So you're close, but we do appreciate you taking the time to get here, to be here, to help us out as we understand this and what it looks like in rural communities. Human trafficking, when we think of it, we think of maybe more urban settings. We don't necessarily think about what it looks like in rural settings. So that's one of the things that we hope to address here today and actually put some conversation around that and how we in our rural communities can start to address this. We do know that the Route 15 and 80 corridor is really a hot spot for this. So we're right in the middle of it. So we might as well be talking about it and why not do it in a rural setting? So that's why we chose this. One of the reasons we chose this location. It's beautiful too. So, but thank you so much. And we look forward to learning more from our testimony today so that we can hopefully draft some policy to be able to engage on this at a higher level. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Alette. Again, thank you for having us here in your beautiful district. This issue is one that before I got into office, it just felt very distant. It felt like something that was happening somewhere else, not happening in Pennsylvania. As a father of 8 children and coming into office and learning how prevalent this type of activity is, even in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, it became very disturbing. And many of my colleagues in the House, including Representative Alette and others, have really led on these issues to try and limit this activity as much as possible. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about how we can do that effectively. We have 2 panels today, 5 testifiers. The first panel is the community panel. We have Corin Moon, the founder of the Lantern Rescue, and Scott Henry, the president of the Northern Tier Law Enforcement Instructors Group. If you could all keep it between 3 and 5 minutes when you testify. I'm not going to gavel you out if you're a little bit longer. Yeah, we got time, but we do like having a lot of time for the Q&A section so we can have some positive interactions. So, all right. Ms. Moon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Kale, Representative Alette, members of the Policy Committee, and distinguished guests. Thank you for being here with us today and dedicating this time to uncovering human trafficking. I want to start out by explaining the organization that I represent. I'm here today on behalf of Lantern Rescue, where I'm honored to serve as the president and founder. Lantern Rescue is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is committed to ending human trafficking. Lantern Rescue focuses on empowering street-level officers and community members that have the most access to victims and most ability to interact with them, by giving them the training and resources necessary to rescue victims of human trafficking and arrest and prosecute their traffickers. This approach exponentially increases the army of people combating this horrific crime around the world and allows more and more victims to be reached every day. Currently, Lantern Rescue is working in 12 countries around the world, one of which is here in the United States. When I first started Lantern Rescue, I naively believed that American law enforcement had the training and resources necessary to investigate and prosecute human trafficking crimes. I'll be the first to admit that I was wrong. They did need more help than I believed. As I began helping in a district attorney's office here in Pennsylvania in a rural area, I quickly realized that street-level officers and many prosecutors did not have the training or knowledge that I believed they had and was required to adequately combat these crimes. Through no fault of their own, officers were not receiving training on human trafficking. Officers that have spoken to us after receiving some of our trainings have tearfully told us that they know they have missed victims in the past, and they can see their faces now thinking back on them. That they have overlooked those victims because they didn't know what human trafficking really looked like, and that they would never miss a victim again. Prosecutors have missed the opportunity to charge a trafficker with human trafficking and miscategorize those crimes as something else, simply because they didn't know differently. How did we get here? How did we as a law enforcement community get to the point that we were missing human trafficking victims and that we were missing traffickers? I believe that we are here because of the proliferation of misconceptions about human trafficking and the lack of training on the realities of it. By definition, human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain a labor or commercial sex act. That definition leaves most of us wanting for more. What is human trafficking really? Human trafficking is really happening here in Pennsylvania. Human trafficking is really happening to kids that are in school with your own children. Human trafficking is really happening between parents and their own children. Misconceptions about human trafficking are proliferated by the media and well-meaning but misunderstanding people on social media. Misconceptions such as all human trafficking victims are children. Misconceptions such as human trafficking victims are always kidnapped. Human trafficking victims are always foreigners. Human trafficking victims are moved to a new place and have to cross borders to be a victim. And that given the opportunity, these victims would run into the arms of police and identify themselves as a victim of human trafficking and ask for help. These are all incorrect. Human trafficking victims can be any age, race, or gender. It is very uncommon for trafficking victims to be kidnapped into human trafficking. Most frequently, traffickers know their victims and are often related or community members with them. To be blunt, traffickers, this increases their exposure to being caught and isn't something they want to bring upon themselves. Traffickers groom their victims over long periods of time. They do so to prevent the victim from being scared off, to increase the victim's reliance on the trafficker, and to develop a false emotional tie to them so they are less willing to turn their traffickers in. The majority of trafficking victims in Pennsylvania are Pennsylvanians. Traffickers are not always bringing in victims from other states or countries. The most bang for their buck is to find victims in their own locality to exploit, lessening the costs of transportation, and as said before, most people think that if someone isn't missing, they can't be a victim of human trafficking. This misconception allows traffickers to operate in plain sight. Sometimes trafficking victims are moved around, especially in foreign countries where they're enticed away from their families by false job opportunities. But for the purpose of this hearing, staying focused on Pennsylvania, most victims are trafficked within their own state. And finally, most victims don't know that they're victims. It's a misconception to believe that victims would go running towards a cop to be saved if given the chance. The reality is most victims don't know that they are victims because of the grooming, as stated before. They believe they have chosen this life and that they owe something to their trafficker. Or maybe they're even protective or emotionally connected to the trafficker. Traffickers also frequently convince their victims that the victims themselves are the ones who will be arrested if the police come, not the traffickers. Here in Pennsylvania, we have had cases of children being trafficked by their own parents. We've had cases of adults being trafficked by someone they believe to be their boyfriend, by children being used in the production of child pornography by their own parents to be sold online for a profit, and victims of labor trafficking. How can we do better? We need to provide training to law enforcement and communities around Pennsylvania. Lantern Rescue has found success in getting to victims and arresting traffickers by training citizens and law enforcement, officers that are invested in their own communities, allowing those with the closest connection to the area and victims to be the ones saving them. Lantern provides trainings that are made to fit the situation and the need. They range from a couple hours to a couple days of training for law enforcement, speaking to school-age students, colleges, churches, hospitals, businesses, and anyone else engaged in the community. These trainings are catered to the audience and what they can do if they believe they've encountered a victim of human trafficking. These tips from the community can go nowhere without the police knowing how to handle that tip, which makes the law enforcement training component so vital. The tips from the community are also instrumental, as without them, law enforcement would miss many victims that don't know that they're victims. Training law enforcement and spreading awareness into the community on what the realities of human trafficking are is essential to dispelling the misconceptions about human trafficking, which will allow us to reach more victims and arrest and prosecute more traffickers. We cannot help Pennsylvania by being in denial about the realities of trafficking. To successfully combat this crime, we must face it head on. This is a heavy topic to discuss, and we're also grateful for you coming here today to hear about it. Thank you.
Mr. Henry.
Good morning, Representative Kale, all representatives. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak before this committee regarding human trafficking and the need to enhance training, education, and awareness on the topic of combating human trafficking. As stated, my name is Scott Henry, and I'm currently a workforce development, law enforcement, and public safety training contractor and provider for the Northern Pennsylvania Regional College, or NPRC as I call it. I'm also president of the Northern Tier Law Enforcement Instructors Group. I have over 38 years of law enforcement background, which included 4 years as a Williamsport Bureau police officer, 21 years with the Pennsylvania State Police, 7 years as chief county, as well as county detective for the Tioga County District Attorney's Office, 5 years as chief police for the Mansfield University Police Department, and currently I stay active in the law enforcement community as a part-time detective for the Lycoming County District Attorney's Office. Also included in my 21 years is I was an instructor and director of the Mansfield University Municipal Police Academy. I cite my background to support my following comments and position to cite the need for enhanced training, education, and awareness as it applies to our law enforcement, public safety, and first responder and criminal justice agencies on the topic of combating human trafficking. A little about the Northern Pennsylvania Regional College. It's the only regional college in Pennsylvania. NPRC currently encompasses a 10-county academic footprint in the northern tier of Pennsylvania. Geographically, this footprint is larger than the state of Connecticut and provides and assists in bringing academic opportunities to over 500,000 rural Pennsylvanians. Regarding NPRC workforce development opportunities, of which I am a part, NPRC provides numerous certificate-related training and educational opportunities not only within the 10-county academic footprint, but throughout Pennsylvania and beyond our borders. NPRC provides both academic and workforce development, affordable education to our residents of northern Pennsylvania, and is proud to offer this programming to our communities through partnerships with businesses, agencies, and organizations based on the needs of the local communities, agencies, and organizations. Over the past year, NPRC has provided me with an opportunity to strengthen a relationship with an organization whose mission, in part, is to fight for those who can't fight for themselves through partnership and mentorship. That organization is Lantern Rescue. The partnership with Lantern Rescue, which began in December of 2023, has provided the opportunity to develop, certify, offer, and execute various human trafficking training and educational programs throughout northern and central Pennsylvania. NPRC and Lantern Rescue know that increasing public awareness about the risks and signs of human trafficking is an important step in a larger strategy. This knowledge and the opportunity it provides is supported by the recent guide published by the President's Interagency Task Force to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons and the Senior Policy Operating Group in 2023. The awareness and now certified human trafficking programs that NPRC and Lantern Rescue collaborate on providing have been attended by members of law enforcement, probation, prosecutors, church leaders, and members of various congregations, educators, social workers, many more at no cost. The programs have been provided in various urban and rural areas to offset attendees' time and travel expenses. Programs provided through NPRC and Lantern Rescue through the collaboration have indicated that there is a desire to attend a training on the topic of combating human trafficking. Additional training is needed and sought by our law enforcement and first responder communities, in addition to our other partners throughout the criminal justice and social services system. It is also apparent, based on our work to date, that insufficient information and education is being provided to our recruits attending our municipal and state police academies, and that our practitioners attending mandatory continuing education on the topic of combating human trafficking is insufficient. I personally support this position and findings with my background as a prior director of a Pennsylvania Municipal Police Academy and my many years of law enforcement combined with annual mandatory continuing ed that is required of all Pennsylvania law enforcement. An example of this is the understanding the legal definition of human trafficking is not It not only includes sexual exploitation, but also includes in the definition labor exploitation and child sexual abuse materials, CSAM. Another example is the lack of providing sufficient training regarding signs and symptoms that human trafficking victims could potentially display upon encounters with a member of law enforcement, which in turn could lead to the law enforcement member not recognizing a potential human trafficking victim, thus not providing a positive intervention to assist the victim. I provide these examples not as a negative towards the agencies that provide recruit and practitioner-related training and education, which have addressed to the best of their abilities in providing information on human trafficking, but to support that combating human trafficking is a constant and evolving learning process to combat the changing and unfortunately evolving methods utilized by traffickers in grooming potential victims, technologies utilized by the traffickers, etc. If I may, I would like to provide a positive example of the training and education provided to date. Based on an awareness program that we provided, and that we includes NPRC and Lantern Rescue, and based on at the conclusion of every training program that resources are available to assist agencies and individuals excuse me, in numerous ways on the issue of combating human trafficking, we received a call for assistance from an individual regarding the disappearance of a family member who suffered from mental health-related disabilities. Based on this call, assistance was provided not only to the family but to law enforcement, and the missing family member was located within hours of disappearing based on diligent work provided by law enforcement. More information cannot be provided at this time due to the ongoing criminal investigation that's still ongoing into the matter. Still, it is fair to say that the assistance provided positively impacted this case. In addition to the information about the awareness, the family had access to supportive resources and Lantern Rescue personnel who provided valuable insight to the law enforcement personnel involved in this case. So recommendations: 1, that the House Republican Policy Committee, with assistance provided by Corinne Moon, founder of Lantern Rescue and practicing prosecutor for the Lycoming County District Attorney's Office, review current state criminal statutes that apply currently to combating human trafficking. Based upon this review, appropriate enhancements to current criminal statutes or new criminal statutes be addressed legislatively. Number 2, that appropriate legislative direction be provided, such as to our Act 120 Municipal Police Academies and Municipal Police Officer and Education Commission, mandating that all Pennsylvania police recruits and practitioners receive an appropriate 8-hour initial certified training course in combating human trafficking, and that all Pennsylvania state police practitioners receive a minimum 2 hours annual mandatory in-service training on combating human trafficking. Number 3, that appropriate state funding be provided to educational entities that offer certified training and education regarding combating human trafficking, and that the training be offered free of charge to law enforcement, public safety and first responder agencies, county emergency management agencies, educators, social and public service agencies, etc. Number 4, that appropriate state funding be provided to educational entities that offer certified training and education regarding combating human trafficking, and that the training be offered free of charge to a staff of a location that might encounter human trafficking, such as hotels, restaurants, grocery stores, etc. And last, that appropriate state funding be provided to promote awareness materials to our public, such as billboards, television advertisements, pamphlets, signage, indicating signs and symptoms of human trafficking victims, and the steps to report observations of potential human trafficking occurring. I appreciate and thank each member of today's committee for hearing all testimony offered today and for the committee's interest in finding solutions to combat human trafficking here in Pennsylvania. In turn, these solutions will have a positive impact on combating domestic and international human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Alette.
Thank you for your testimony, and I was thinking I'd maybe start with you, Corinne. You've traveled the world combating human trafficking, and you've seen it in other countries, you've seen it in urban settings, you've seen it in rural settings. What would be maybe a couple key things that we as the community, I mean, there's a lot of community members here as well, what are some of the misconceptions when it comes to a rural community? And you kind of hit on that. I want you to go in a little bit deeper. That things that we could specifically that would be helpful for us to realize and understand from maybe some, without going into detail, some of the cases that you've handled and you've been a part of. I mean, this is meant to be camouflaged. Mm-hmm. You know, we're getting ready to go into hunting season, and obviously everybody's wearing camouflage, and you can't. Like, the idea is not to see them, right? So the idea is to not be able to see what's going on, and they're actively trying to do that every single day to come up with new ways to camouflage the heinous crimes that are happening. So how do we help us understand how we can break through some of that to see it so that we can help law enforcement through this to be able to help these folks ultimately?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is a hidden crime. It's meant to be unseen. A lot of the symptoms for sex trafficking, specifically of minors here in the United States, is going to present very similar to sexual assault. A lot of these victims are, and what we're seeing more and more is them being exploited online. Recently, we're seeing an uptick in live streaming platforms where the children go online. They go live in their bedrooms, and they stream to thousands of abusers online, which they're paid for. It's almost a request-based service where the viewers will pay to have them commit sex acts. With that, that's going to be something that, parents need to be very closely monitoring what their children are doing and not being naive enough to believe that just because they're in the home that they're safe. Some of the most trafficking victims that we've seen, some of the most horrific crimes, go home every night to their parents and they go to school every day. They're not missing. And it's very hard to identify stuff that's going on in that way, but I would, especially as the community, I would really encourage just using your humanity, interacting with the people around you and really seeing them. Don't be too busy to take a moment and to talk to someone in your community. With labor trafficking, we've seen an uptick in that recently in America. As we know, there's an increase in the porousness of the border. Most labor trafficking victims in the States are foreigners. That is something that differs from sex trafficking. Most labor trafficking victims are generally foreigners. With that, it's again difficult to identify, but there's some things that you can use there. So a lot of indicators, and it's not 100%. We don't generally teach to red flags because we don't want people to think if they're there, it's definitely trafficking. If they're not, it's definitely not, right? But there's some, you can use them as guideposts. With labor trafficking, if you know of massage parlors, restaurants, agriculture, those are some of the industries we see it in the most here in the United States. And often labor trafficking victims will be kind of shuttled around. They're always inside of one vehicle. They're living inside of one house. They have very limited interaction with the public, and they often don't have control of their own documents. So it's stuff to think about. It's stuff to, when you drive past, agricultural areas, restaurants, massage parlors, if you're noticing stuff like that, it's definitely a tip to put in. And, we do see the sex trafficking of children by their own parents, physical abuse, sometimes by people that they believe to be their boyfriends. If there's a child by their own parents, it truly is just very difficult to detect. Usually those tips come in through family members, or if the child does get an awareness lesson in school and they disclose.
Morning.
Hello?
I had to go with that guy yesterday with his phone.
Oh boy. Yes, those are difficult to detect when it's done, perpetrated by the parents. But we do see another, it's called the lover boy effect or the Romeo effect. If you have a chance to cruise that, it's the grooming of a victim by someone that claims to be a boyfriend or a significant other of the victim and slowly encourages them to start sleeping with their friends for money, to start to have sexual encounters with other people for money, and it quickly evolves into a point where they are a full-blown trafficker and they have several girls that they're doing this to. We've seen this happening as young as 12 years old here in Pennsylvania. So noticing that as parents, as community members, that you interact with children, a child that has a much older boyfriend, a controlling boyfriend, they're getting gifts that seem unusual for their status. They're in the house with extra phones. They're communicating secretly. These are difficult to detect, and this is often why they're categorized and mischarged by prosecutors and police, because they present as other crimes. And it does take a lot of humanity and a lot of really getting into the weeds and uncovering what's truly going on in these cases.
Just a follow-up question. You're talking about a lot of our students, the next generation that's coming. How do we help our school districts as well understand this as they spend probably more time than anybody with our kids? How do we help them to identify some of these things? Is there anything that Lantern can do, has done to help? And we've kind of talked about the law enforcement side, which is really good, but how do we help our school districts as well?
Yeah, giving presentations to school-age students and to teachers so that they're able to understand. After the first presentation I gave to a classroom of 22 junior high students, they were 7th and 8th graders, 8 students disclosed abuse that they didn't understand was abuse out of 22. Yeah, so about a third of the room, disclosed abuse that they didn't understand was abuse. They thought this is what everyone does with their boyfriend online. They thought this is how everyone's parents treated them. They didn't understand until they got that. And they had the good touch, bad touch talk. That's not enough anymore. Nowadays, the perversion online and the deviance from the norm is way more increased than it was 15, 10, 20 years ago. So this is something that we're having to have a specific conversation about how people are grooming them, about how, the boys that they're meeting online are not real, that this is not something that they want to be engaging in. And it's a high hill to climb, but the students are actually usually very receptive to this. It's actually harder often to get through to the parents that don't want to believe that this is happening in their area.
Thank you for your work, and I'll turn it over to the chairman. Thank you.
Representative Flick.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you both for being here. In fact, thank you to everybody for being here. This is a great room. To follow up a little bit for either of you on Clint Outlet with the school districts, do these victims also often have mental health or drug and alcohol or co-occurring conditions? And if in fact they do, would it not be incumbent on us to get each of the county drug and alcohol agencies and mental health agencies trained to be able to ask those questions when a 13-year-old comes into, in Lycoming County, West Branch Drug and Alcohol, or White Deer Treatment Center, or Northern Tier, to have them partake in this to get them, incorporated in the same thing as everybody else? I think, Mr. Henry, you want to? All right.
Yes. So, actually, kind of an advertisement. I'm actually teaching to West Branch on October 4th. So this exact class. But yes, I wouldn't say this is kind of two-parted. So eventually children, I like to talk about adult victims a lot because people overlook them, and often adult victims were children victims that no one found. Adult victims are more common to have issues with drug and alcohol abuse. The mental health is kind of across the spectrum. I would say it is less of mental health and more of they have experienced some abuse in the past and they're looking for some type of affection or some type of relationship to fill that void. Traffickers like to exploit vulnerabilities, and they will pick up on these very quickly. Often with drug and alcohol abuse, we see that more in parents that traffic their children. Every parent that we've encountered that has been trafficking their children has had an issue either with drugs, alcohol, or both. So yes, training absolutely needs to happen to everyone, including our drug and alcohol treatment centers. A lot of victims that become adult victims that were never rescued and they continue to be abused into their adulthood will develop drug and alcohol problems as a way to cope with what's going on. The mental health is kind of a hit or miss. Yes, we do see that. We've seen it in a couple cases, but I wouldn't say it's super high percentage of it, but yes, we do see that.
Okay, and just to follow up on the funding part of it then, based on that answer, so we can look at more than just PCCD then. We could actually look at DDOP dollars and OMSOS dollars and other human services dollars. So maybe I'll follow up with both of you on that. So, okay, again, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Representative Rowe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Kind of piggybacking off of what Representative Outlet said, you spoke to, speaking to children in the classroom, right, who didn't understand that they were experiencing some kind of abuse. And if you go to, gas station bathrooms or airport bathrooms, you'll see like some of those signs that'll say like, if you are a victim of human trafficking, know the sign, that sort of thing. But if these people are failing to self-identify as being abused at all, they might think, oh yeah, I'll look out and see if somebody's doing that, not realizing that they're the one that should be doing that. So is there a way to kind of get those individuals that are not in the classroom, they're not a captive audience, to get them to sort of come to that self-realization and self-identify? Is there something, know the signs of human trafficking? Also, if this is happening to you, you might be one of those people who should be making this sign. Is there a way that you can communicate that out there to help those people who don't realize that they're experiencing this abuse, to help them be able to self-identify, to then take that corrective action on their own, since it's so difficult to communicate with them otherwise?
Yeah, that's a great point to make, and I actually make that point very frequently when I speak about trafficking, that I know of victims that have walked past those signs and thought that that's really sad. I'm so glad I'm not a victim of trafficking, and they are being actively victimized. My thought on that is to add like a little subsection to there's usually those signs are very they have big graphics and they're very eye catchy, but to have, rather, using the space more wisely than a really cool picture, to have something in there that is saying, if you're experiencing these things, you may be a victim. Please call this to ask more questions. That would be beneficial. The only other way, it's very difficult. Trafficking victims are not generally held in basements and chains. They are able to interact with the community. They generally have phones, connectivity to the internet. A media campaign might be beneficial for that. That's not something I personally specialize in, but I do think something like that could be beneficial for these victims, because yes, it is very common for a victim to walk right past that sign and truly have no idea that they're a victim of trafficking.
Well, thank you very much for your work on this. Mr. Henry, if I can ask you on your first recommendation when you referenced appropriate enhancements to be addressed legislatively, can you flesh that out? What is the appropriate enhancement? Is there a loophole we're trying to close? Are we elevating, current statutes? You said create new ones. What loopholes do we need to close here?
Well, as mentioned, I think it would be a good time, Representative, that we sit and we review what's currently within Title 18, et cetera, and to make appropriate, with that review, some appropriate recommendations on changes or amendments. I'll use technologies as an example as they evolve. And so much of what I'm talking about today I've learned from here. We are so fortunate to have this resource locally and regionally and knowledge. But that's where I feel strongly, certainly with Corinne's background as a prosecutor too, that with that review, that potential could occur with some appropriate changes. And I think it is with any. I'm all about training and education anymore, Representative Rowe. How then we translate that into the educational process. For example, all police officers have to have 12 hours every year, and then we have that appropriate change, legislative and statute change, be included within those. That information that's put out to our professionals, law enforcement professionals, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both of you for your expert testimony on this and for all of your work. The more you learn about this issue, the more heartbreaking it is. So thank you for being on the front lines. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Stender.
Ms. Moon, this question would be for you. First, thank you so far for the testimony. It's been already very eye-opening. I tell people, I think in the last 10 years, I thought I had human trafficking training at my previous employer. And obviously, there's already been a bunch of stuff here that I don't remember being covered. So my question would be, do you have training available through any of the, specifically through Department of Health, Bureau of EMS, they have learning management systems. Do you think you have any training available on there to help, our first responders, specifically EMS, or, even our emergency room doctors and nurses? Do you think there's already training available through Department of Health for this type of stuff, or is this something that hasn't necessarily been developed out yet?
I don't know if it has been developed out. I have taught to rooms of physician assistants. I've taught to EMS. I've taught to people like that, nurses, emergency room, all kinds of people in the medical field. So, and most of them, it is the first time that they've been encountering stuff like this. There is really good training for SANE nurses. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And it would be beneficial to have something similar to that, or have the SANE nurses trained as, have an additional bit that is part of human trafficking. That would be beneficial as well, but I'm not sure if they have anything in there. I have taught to several different medical fields, though.
All right. Yeah, and I only bring it up. In my past career when I was a firefighter, we used to joke all the time that everybody in our community would talk to the firemen before they would ever talk to the police officers. Mm-hmm. We're not getting anybody in trouble per se, so they were always quick to talk to us, specifically really the 6 to 16-year-old age group. Yep. They were stopping by the firehouses all the time, and you learn more about the community that way. So it's always, some of this stuff's very helpful to, just get a sense of, how this has already changed and developed. So I appreciate the testimony. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? I have a couple of questions myself. And this is for either of the testifiers. It was mentioned children online. I think we, Ms. Moon, that we have children being exploited online. We have this perception within our culture, maybe it's just my own perception, that we have at least a federal government that's omnipresent, that can see everything, hears everything, that NSA is out there storing all this data. How is it that it's not easier to prosecute these instances, and what can we do to make sure that these people are being put in prison and where they need to go, the ones that are exploiting kids?
Yeah, I would say with that, a lot of it is just that the amount of exploitation that's occurring online is unattainable for law enforcement to tackle on their own, and that in addition to that, there's still a lot of counties in Pennsylvania and places in the country that sentence people to probation for possession of CSAM, which is the new word for child pornography. We've mentioned it before. The lack of consistency across the state in sentencing for these crimes is not beneficial to prosecutors to be able to actually get these people behind bars and to be able to set precedent that this isn't something that we'll tolerate. Lycoming County does a great job with this, but I know that there's other places that aren't able to do that. So, but the massive amount, and when I'm talking about live streaming, it's going on right now. There's kids in Pennsylvania. We very recently identified a child in Pennsylvania that's doing this within the last couple of days. And that's just one that we have in one of our cases. There's thousands more out there we haven't found yet. There are kids in Pennsylvania that stayed home from school today that are live streaming their own abuse online right now. Those live streams, the detection software, if it's even available on the platforms they're using, isn't able to keep up. By the time the stream ends, it goes nowhere until we actually arrest someone and find it on their device. The cyber tips aren't able to keep up with this stuff. It's just the prolific amount that it's happening. It's always better to prevent it, of course, to have the children never self-abuse, never do this online. But we're not going to be able to shovel the snow while it's still snowing. There has to be the prosecution and the investigation and the police aspect, but at the same time, educating the community and these children of what this actually is, and that these videos and images will be online forever, and that this isn't something that is normal or something that they should be doing or have to be doing. So that it has to be twofold there, because at this rate that we're seeing this increase, which is exponential, there's no way law enforcement will be able to keep up.
What platforms? Is this Instagram, Facebook?
It's on Instagram.
Twitter?
Anything that you can live stream on, Snapchat, Instagram. There's a new one called Peegle, Peegle. That's a new live streaming platform that's emerged in the last couple months to a year. And they're getting on there paying tokens, paying coins to get these very young girls to abuse themselves on camera.
It's hard for me to fathom that how you can't figure out a way, whether it's the platform, whether it's whoever, the feds can't figure out a way to monitor that and eliminate that that situation. But clearly it's happening and it's a problem and we need to act on it. So thank you. Yep.
Thank you.
Just real quick, I mean, obviously this hearing's being streamed as well.
Yes.
If somebody, that might happen to be watching this, wants to reach out to you or to somebody, what's the best way to do that? I mean, if somebody feels like they're stuck in this trafficking situation, are there ways that they can even now reach out to law enforcement or?
Yeah, absolutely. 911 is always obviously available, but there is the National Trafficking Hotline. It's 888-373-7888 is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And then Lantern Rescue is available on all social media platforms. Our website has a contact us. Very easy to get in contact with us. So, yeah, thank you.
More questions.
No,
Representative, sir.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Chairman. I just had a question, on their immigration status. We know a lot of them are coming here and they're being trafficked for the labor industry and whatever. How do we go about, and who do we report it to? Do we go to the district attorney? Do we go to our local law enforcement if we have those questions? Because they're going to deny it. We don't want to make a big stink out of people who are being housed at a hotel. And knowing that some of these people, who do we get to investigate a particular thing without being a jerk about it, that they're here legally?
Right.
Already, and they have a work visa, but how do we investigate that portion of it without trying to be like we're racist or we're against illegal immigration or
Yes.
Whatever. I don't know how to go forward with a circumstance that we came up with, that there's a bunch of foreigners in a hotel, they're being bused to the factory to work and they're being bused back. How do we interact with those people, or even find do they have a permit to be here in the country? Do they have a permit to be working? legally in in our country versus are they here illegally and they are being trafficked for the workforce?
Yeah, it is very difficult. It presents a lot of issues there with, you don't want to be perceived as having a bias and right. The district attorney's office is a great place to start. The FBI is doing a lot of work in this kind of stuff with the labor, and they're able to check records and see how many workers are registered, and that will correspond or not with how many people are actually going there every day. So there's ways that you can start it very low grade, checking into the taxes and more stuff like that before you get into that.
Well, that's what we run up against. There's 20 people there. How do we know if they're legal, illegal, if they're being trafficked, if they're here on their own free will, or were they brought into this country, helpless, and are pushed towards that trafficking? So
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
I have one follow-up question before we go to the next panel. Just for context of what we're dealing with here, is there any estimation on how large this industry is? Because that's certainly, it seems what it is an industry.
Yeah, so the estimates, they vary. The most common numbers are about 28 million to 50 million, and it just depends on how your definition of trafficking rolls out, including child brides and human sacrifice, which are not ones that I covered today for topics, but we see them more commonly in Africa and parts of Asia that we work in, which is a much longer conversation for another time. But so it's about somewhere between 28 and 50 million. Very hard to estimate, again, because most people don't self-identify as trafficking victims. The industry itself is, in criminal enterprise statistics, is second behind the drug trade, and it brings in about 150 billion a year. Again, estimates, because they're not generally filing taxes on these numbers, but these are estimates, and it is projected to overtake the drug industry within the next couple of years, within the next decade at the most. And to be blunt about it, organized crime is very quickly realizing that they can sell humans multiple times a day. They can only sell drugs once. They're getting more financial gain from trafficking in humans than they are for trafficking in drugs. And oftentimes, the victims are convinced to lie. They're convinced to hide their traffickers' crimes. And in trafficking, the evidence is the human, which can lie. In drugs, the evidence is the drugs, which you always know is illegal. So they're able to hide their crimes a lot easier and make more of a profit off of it.
Is the industry as organized as the drug cartel industry, or is it the same people?
Yeah, there's a lot of consistencies across the board with drug dealers that we often see become human traffickers, or they are both. I wouldn't say all the time, though. Like I said, parents traffic their children. There's that bit, kind of like your low-level drug dealers as well. Parents traffic their own children. They're not generally part of organized crime, but we do see organized crime groups, yes, operating the same way that they do in the drug trade.
Thank you both very much for your testimony. I
Thank you.
appreciate you being here. All right, we are going to move to our next panel. Our second panel, the law enforcement panel. We have the Honorable Joseph Peters, the District Attorney for Wyoming County. With Heather Castellino, the Chief Deputy Attorney, Human Trafficking Section of the Office of the Attorney General. Gabriel Fabian, the Special Agent Human Trafficking Section of the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Peters, when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Aulette, for hosting, and distinguished members of the panel. It's a pleasure for me to be here this morning, and I come here today having spent over 40 years in law enforcement, starting as a street cop, eventually becoming the chief or the director of the Office of Attorney General's Bureau of Narcotics Investigation, becoming after law school, eventually the state's chief drug prosecutor under 6 different attorneys general of both parties, having been a federal U.S. DOJ organized crime prosecutor in Philadelphia, and then having worked in 2 White Houses, 2 years each, in the Clinton and George W. Bush White Houses on drugs and terrorism. Having said all that, and I say it because I come here never imagining that I would be saying that this human trafficking crisis is the most heinous crime that I have seen, not only as a crime individually, but the web of crimes that intersect and interplay with human trafficking. Excuse me. Young girls, and yes, I said girls, not women, become in many cases human trafficking victims are 12, 13, 14 years old. They're girls. And boys are also victims, as well as are adults. They are therefore easy prey for predators who either groom or extort, or both, these adolescents into involuntary servitude. All for the sake of making money, and unaffected that these predators are crushing a life and a future of a young person and their family in the process. Even worse is how these vultures use the addictive nature of social media to leverage their recruitment of girls, grooming them with lies, and these lies all lie at the intersection and capitalize upon adolescence, curiosity, insecurity, and peer pressure, and when combined with that internet, provide a direct link for human trafficking cartels to reach into the bedrooms, the phones, the computers, and lives of children whose unsuspecting parents are right down the hall. We cannot put our collective heads in the sand, assuming that there is not the outward indication of human trafficking as depicted on television, wherein a young woman is kidnapped and never to be seen again. But instead, we must recognize that the face of human trafficking in Pennsylvania, even in our rural counties, is here, but is different. And without talking about an actual case, the face of human trafficking is the young 13-year-old girl who has been groomed by an older predator, male or female. This man has seen her posts on social media, posts wherein she laments that she is not popular, or she's being bullied, or she's depressed, or not pretty. The groomer swoops in, Prince Charming, playing on her emotions, telling her how beautiful she is inside and out, eventually convincing her that they can have a life together, but they need to make money in order to run away and have their future. All in, this young girl will do anything, and the predator provides her with the anything, which is to have sex with his friends as their easy way to cash in and begin their future. Now, the predator assures her that he doesn't see this 12 or 13 or 14-year-old as being disloyal because she is having sex with his friends. To the contrary, and as part of the grooming and the manipulation, oh no, you are helping us. You are doing it out of your love for me. So if you have sex with as many of my friends as possible, our future can begin sooner than later. Meanwhile, while all this is happening, a short distance from the school oftentimes, where she's been picked up by her pimp, Mom thinks her daughter is at track or band practice when instead her little girl is turning tricks for an older man from 3 to 5 p.m. and then comes home for dinner with her parents being none the wiser. If the love story doesn't work, that trick by the predator, then he already has what he needs to extort this young girl. He will threaten her with showing pictures to her parents, putting the videos on the internet, and unless she cooperates, he might even kill her. And that is if she doesn't resort to suicide on her own. What can we do? We can do plenty. We have task forces created. We need to create more on the law enforcement side. I have task forces. I have a Homeland Security agent, and the primary mission of Homeland Security investigations is their investigative component, is human trafficking and all of the crimes interwoven into human trafficking. And what crimes are they? Drug trafficking, unlawful guns, money laundering, other organized criminal activities. They all feed one into the other. It is drugs often that keep these young girls involved and trapped into human trafficking. These task forces must contain federal, state, county, and local law enforcement. We've learned these lessons painfully in the past. One, don't put our heads in the sand. We did that with the gang problem 50 years ago in places like Los Angeles and Chicago and New York. And where are we now with a gang problem? It takes leadership. And often the DA is the person who has the credibility to step up. It's not popular. The Chamber of Commerce is not going to like you if you're talking about human trafficking in their community, or the real estate brokers, or the school district. But if you lead, and if you engage them, and if you make it clear you are coming right through them unless they want to be a part of this battle and part of the solution, then we can integrate law enforcement. The other integration has to come in the larger sense, as others of our panelists have indicated. We need to have teachers and parents and social workers and counselors and health professionals. And we need to teach all of them the indicators, just like we taught police officers what to look for to interdict somebody going down the highway doing drug trafficking. We can do the same thing with our law enforcement by saying, when you stop a car and there was a young girl who is of a different ethnicity than the two older guys in the front, and she's got a brand new phone and a credit card in the other hand, and she's 13 years old and she's speaking a different language than them, sometimes you just need to hit someone over the head because so much is going on in a traffic stop. That same teaching of indicators can apply to all of those other people, as has been talked about, the teachers, the healthcare professionals, in every one of their venues. And I think the last thing, and maybe the most important thing as I close, is to tell parents, don't worry about being your children's friend. Be their parent. Draw that line. Get into their business. Get into their bedroom. Get into their phones. And lastly, just spend time and talk. There's no wrong way to be a parent as long as you're spending time and talking to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Castillo.
So good morning, Chairman, representatives. Thank you very much for having us today and giving us the opportunity to talk about this subject matter. I have some prepared written testimony, and I'll actually say I'm going to cut it a little short because I don't want to be overly repetitive because it seems as though a lot of us are on the same page and we're hearing a lot of the same things. But thank you on behalf of the Commonwealth and Attorney General Henry. One of the things that I'm going to echo, because we've heard it here this morning, is that this topic is becoming more and more talked about in recent years, but it's often misunderstood. I will say that the federal law and the Pennsylvania laws are similar in how they define human trafficking. The human trafficking laws in Pennsylvania address two types of human trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. In 2014, Act 105 extensively revised the law on human trafficking in Pennsylvania. The act comes right out and says it's focused on the prevention, prosecution, and protection. The Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General has tackled this crime for over a decade with this focus in mind. The two main statutes criminalizing human trafficking in Pennsylvania are trafficking in individuals and involuntary servitude. Both of these offenses are included under the rubric of human trafficking to ensure that both the persons who arrange for an individual to be subjected to involuntary servitude and the persons who maintain that individual in a state of involuntary servitude are both subject to this chapter. Involuntary servitude is further divided into two categories, labor and sexual servitude. Title 18, Section 3012 defines involuntary servitude and lists the means by which an individual can be subject to such. I think it's important to note that there are 13 separate means listed in this section, and they can be broken down to categories of either force, fraud, or coercion. I think it's of utmost importance, and we've heard this already this morning, but to note that only one of those 13 means is kidnapping. During my testimony, I'll use the terms victim and survivor, and I'd like to say that the use of the term victim in this context is not meant in any way to demean or diminish the individual in that role. Rather, it is the legal term under Pennsylvania law. Truly, an individual subjected to human trafficking is and should be referred to as a survivor. We've heard that if a victim is a minor, there's no need to prove any of the means listed that I referenced above. There's no need to show threats, harm, restraint, kidnapping, etc., to show that a minor has been subjected to sexual servitude. As such, any commercial sex act involving a minor counts as trafficking under Pennsylvania law. One of the most common misconceptions regarding human trafficking is that trafficking requires the movement of someone or something from country to country, state to state, or county to county, when in fact, the crime of human trafficking requires no movement at all. In light of Attorney General Henry's recognition of the seriousness of this crime and her dedication to fighting for justice for victims and survivors, this past January, she formed the first statewide human trafficking section in the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General. In January of 2023, the AOPC released a follow-up report with statistics from 2017 to 2021. This report included statistics for the time period that the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office had concurrent jurisdiction to prosecute trafficking cases. We were granted concurrent jurisdiction in 2018. The AOPC reported that during this time period, a total of 259 human trafficking cases were filed and a total of 1,096 human trafficking offenses were filed. I think it bears mentioning that most of the significant human trafficking cases in recent memory have been prosecuted by the Attorney General's office. It's also noteworthy that the AOPC statistics tally counts as opposed to cases. Just like to briefly mention some of the significant cases without a lot of detail that the Attorney General's office has had the opportunity to investigate and prosecute. We've been working with the State Police Organized Crime Unit investigating and prosecuting human trafficking cases since 2009. That was our first case, and we investigated and prosecuted an organization in Philadelphia that trafficked multiple women and forced them to have sex with up to 20 men per day. In another case, a defendant was convicted of trafficking multiple young women across the country and forcing them into sexual servitude in suburban Philadelphia. In a third case, the largest sex trafficking case ever charged in this Commonwealth, which involved the testimony of 8 victim survivors at a trial against 2 notorious traffickers who operated in several counties in southeastern and central Pennsylvania, as well as southern New Jersey. In these cases, as well as several others, have resulted in sentences that are essentially life sentences for all of those defendants. We've heard a little bit about labor trafficking this morning, and I'd like to say that the Attorney General's office also has several labor trafficking cases currently under investigation. Many of these cases involve foreign undocumented workers who came to Pennsylvania in hopes of gaining employment to better their lives and the lives of their families. In some cases, the workers were hoping to send money back to their families in their native country who were living in poverty. Instead, their trafficker employers used their vulnerabilities to force them into working unreasonably long hours in impossible conditions. The victims suffer physical and mental abuse, all in an effort to keep them working for the traffickers. Some were forced to live in small apartments, sleeping on the floor with other exploited co-workers. Oftentimes, the trafficker held a debt that the worker owed for getting them into Pennsylvania over the worker's head to keep them working in these deplorable conditions. Documentation necessary to prove their legal status in Pennsylvania is often withheld from them by their traffickers in an effort to keep victims from reporting these abuses to law enforcement. Our newly formed human trafficking section works closely with our fair labor section on cases where severe labor exploitation rise to the level of criminal labor trafficking. I'd like to also note, as I heard during the first panel, there was a discussion about parents and familial trafficking as it related to sex trafficking. We recently prosecuted a case in rural Pennsylvania. I'm not going to get into the specifics because things are still pending. But in that case, there was a foster parent who trafficked a foster child and another child through labor. Just a couple other notes, and I will turn it over to my colleague. But I'd like to also note that our new human trafficking section will continue to work with the Pennsylvania State Police Organized Crime Unit, Homeland Security Investigations, the FBI, as well as other federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. We will also continue to work with our specialized sections and units already in existence with the Attorney General's office, including our child predator section, our organized crime section, fair labor section, asset forfeiture, and money laundering sections. I'd like to take a moment to talk about demand reduction. The focus on human trafficking is often on the traffickers themselves, but the very economy in which human traffickers thrive would not exist but for the market for human beings they are trafficking. That market is validated and enhanced when individuals are allowed to seek out these victim survivors and purchase access to their bodies. The trafficker's crime impacts the community through the encouragement of prostitution and the market for human trafficking in this Commonwealth. This concept comports with the basic economic theory that supply and distribution follow demand, and therefore aids in eliminating the commercial sex trade in an effective way. One way to reduce demand would be to increase the penalties for purchasing sex. For example, in the state of Pennsylvania, a third offense for retail theft can result in the conviction of a felony, regardless of the value of the merchandise. But the actual process of purchasing an individual for sex only ever reaches the conviction of a misdemeanor crime, regardless of how many times they are caught doing so. It is because of these gaps that the demand for sex trafficking will remain at an all-time high. As long as the demand is there, the traffickers will always thrive. I'd like to conclude by saying A.G. Henry and our office have been committed and will continue to respond to both sex and labor trafficking using a victim-centered, trauma-informed, multidisciplinary, and collaborative approach. The Attorney General's office is dedicated to not only tackle human trafficking with the seriousness it deserves, but also be an example of how other jurisdictions can help victims of forced commercial sex and forced labor. Since the announcement of the formation of our unit, we have had a significant influx of new cases through referrals. While this is certainly a good thing, it's important to note that with this increase, we have not been able to proactively work and seek out cases as we were in the past. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for the funding and the independent line item for our human trafficking section. but to also let you know that since the governor's budget otherwise fell short, that you will be hearing from Marguerite Quinn from our office in the near future because we have not been able to build out as we wanted to. And I say that with a smile on my face, but I don't want to in any way diminish the seriousness of that request. And I'd like to end by just saying, really appreciate this opportunity. I'm also a career prosecutor. I've been a prosecutor for about 30 years, and I've been working specifically on human trafficking cases for about 15. And next to me is my colleague's Senior Supervisory Special Agent, Gabriel Fabian.
Mr. Fabian, floor is yours.
Sure.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Good morning. Thank you for inviting us here. Anytime I'm in a room full of people committed to combating human trafficking, I feel grateful and happy to be a part of it. I promise I'm not going to be 5 minutes, so you won't need to gavel me down. However, that might be good bragging rights, so I'm not opposed to it. A little bit, I like it. I appreciate that. So a little bit about me. 10 years ago, I was similar to you, Chairman. I was completely naive to human trafficking. I had no idea what it was. I was a uniformed trooper working the street. I went to a presentation, and the stat that they threw out hit me right in the face. It was, today, right now, there are more slaves alive in the world than the sum total of the transatlantic slave trade. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. So I pushed pause on law enforcement, signed up with an NGO, went abroad, did anti-human trafficking work, came back, jumped back into law enforcement. Fast forward 10 or 11 or 12 years now. Child exploitation and human trafficking cases are my bread and butter. It's what I do. I'm a qualified expert. Happy to work these cases because I work alongside people that truly believe in this, as do I. So what I wanted to do, because I've coming on the tail of many good presentations, I don't think I'm going to bring anything new as far as information goes, but I'd like to bring a little bit of nuance. So what I would like to do is explain to you something that will make the crime of human trafficking click. You'll understand the crime. And I also want to elucidate why the application of that crime is so tricky. So, a little show of hands. How many of you representatives are familiar with Larry Nassar? A couple? Some. Larry Nassar was the gymnastics coach who sexually assaulted just countless children and was charged for it and will hopefully rot in jail for a long time. Anyone familiar with the coach? So he was the physician. The head coach was John Geddard. John Geddard was charged with human trafficking. So how, right? How do you charge the head coach of an elite gymnastics studio with human trafficking? Because you have parents and guardians that are not only willingly bringing their kids to be trained by this guy, but they're paying him money to do it. They're saying, please train my kid. I'm not going to get into the weeds of this because then I will go over my 5 minutes. He was exploiting them. So he was using his power and his authority to exploit the gymnastics students and the prestige of being a gold medal, tri-star gym. That was almost like the currency. So he was being paid to train these young girls, but that prestige is what really mattered, and he would mentally dominate them. And if you listen to interviews with the victims, the survivors from his gymnastics studio, when they talk about both, they don't talk about Larry Nassar in a good way, but they say, comparatively, I would take more time with Larry Nassar if it didn't mean I had to spend one more day with John Geddard? So what sense does that make? Because Larry Nassar was the hands-on offender. He was the rapist. John Geddard was the bully head coach. That's where the complexity comes in. Title 18, Chapter 30, 3012B enumerates the ways you can human traffic someone. It's almost exhaustive. You can kidnap them, you can coerce them, you can do this. And then 3012B says any plan, pattern, or scheme that causes another individual to believe that if they didn't perform the labor or service, that they or someone else would suffer harm. It's a plan, pattern, and scheme. Frequently, it takes the form of commercial sex work, online ads, online exploitation, frequently. But the reason human trafficking is so complex is it can take any shape and any form in any community, right? So you have your classic examples, but then you have the John Geddards of the world that are gymnastics coaches. It's about exploitation. You can understand the crime, right? If you cause another individual to believe that if they don't perform a labor or service, they're going to suffer harm, or a family member or some loved one, another person will suffer harm. You're exploiting them to do something they really don't want to do. That's the crime, but that's the complexity too, is like what shape and what form does that take in our society? So everyone wants a solution, and we're all goal-oriented and solution-driven people in this room, I feel, but it's really tricky. We can hedge our bets, we can do our best. There are ways to combat it and tackle it, but any time we want like an antibiotic that just solves it, and it's really not that easy, because when you want to understand human trafficking, what you really have to understand, not just the crime, but like how it looks in real life, you have to understand vulnerability and exploitation, because the victims that are being exploited come from childhood abuse, neglect, like all of these concentric circles of vulnerability within society. And that's like every time you have another vulnerability, it's like one of your defenses is stripped away. So we have many resources and like defenses. We might have finance. We're not impoverished. We might have access to family that cares about us and looks after us, friends, coworkers. If I went missing for a couple days, Heather would be calling my wife saying like, what is going on? That is like a protection. But if you flip that, when people don't have that, they're vulnerable, and they're vulnerable to exploitation. I think that's my conclusion.
We're going to open up for questions. Representative Alette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would venture to say we've all sat through a lot of testimony over the years. This is probably the heaviest and the most angering testimony that we've had, at least for me. I mean, it's my blood pressure's for sure up. Mr. Peters, I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more. We have a number of surrounding DAs from us here that are actively working as well. You have quite a job description, or not job description, but resume that you have and experience. And now you're the Wyoming County DA. Talk to us a little bit about what you've been doing and the work that you're doing in Wyoming County to help us understand a little bit more of what it can look like in rural communities, and as well as just a continued inspiration for rural counties all across the Commonwealth that are looking to engage. I think you started down there a little bit talking about like the chamber. You're not going to be popular with the chambers. I don't think anybody cares at this point if we're popular with the chambers, if we're going to, help our kids. So if you can elaborate a little bit more on what some things that you've been working on and maybe inspire some of our rural communities as well.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. You used the word inspiration and inspire twice in the same sentence as my name. May I please have a recording so I can play it for my mom?
It'll be made available.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's really a multi-dimensional but concurrently running effort. It's trying to get our police officers and prosecutors, particularly at the local level, while the feds have the expertise and the resources, and certainly as does the state, and we have an attorney general's office in this Commonwealth that's really second to none. Not only, I spent 18 years there as law clerk on up, but some of the most expansive powers of a state attorney general exist in Pennsylvania. And the AGs over time with their staffs have made great use of that. So it's kind of stepping back and walking with our law enforcement officers and training them to use the techniques they already know, but maybe aren't thinking about applying them to the issue of human trafficking. The testimony today was replete with, if not said directly, the fact that there are organized criminal enterprises involved in this. That's the way this works. Yes, there are the one-offs. There's the single predator online. But eventually that person's going to plug into an organization, because without people you can't make money. Without the victim and without the John, you can't make money. So it's teaching our cops. But then, as importantly, we have to get out in the community and let people know, whether it's organizations like Truckers Against Trafficking. Now, who would have thought that truckers and truck stops could be a tool in our quiver to fight human trafficking? And you know why? Because truck drivers are good people. They're like farmers. They work hard every day. They work with their hands. They sacrifice. They want to provide for their families, but they want to be good Americans too. So 99.9% of them are good, and they recognize that in the truck stop, by way of example, is this petri dish, this incubator, this fodder for human trafficking. What better place to bring a young girl with a supply of men who are tired, among other things, in terms of their bodily aspirations, if I can be so crass, than to bring a young girl and work her through that truck stop. In 24 hours, you can make a fortune. But it's that 99% of good truckers, and who would have thought that will be the eyes and the ears, that will see something and say something. And now they are in an organized way where they are looking. Our eyes and ears are all over the road. They're in the truck stops. We can put signs up. We can go into the restrooms, the ladies' rooms, where we can just talk to the women. Because these young girls who are trapped, and Ms. Moon can tell you story after story, those that don't know they're trapped and are loyal, that's a different problem. Those that are trapped and recognize it want an out. And if you give them a sign in a ladies' room that they can go to the counter and say something or do something else and be saved, but then we also have to arm our professionals, our nurses and our teachers and on, counselors, with working with our cops. Because what do? We in law enforcement will be high-fiving each other when we bring down an organization or when we rescue a young girl. But what do we do with her then? And the array of services that she needs from this trauma. What about her family? Where do we take her medically and psychologically? And then how do we go from there for her? So it's this all hands on deck, multilateral approach, law enforcement and public awareness and training, while we go after the predators.
Thank you.
Sure.
Representative Flick.
Thank you all for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps I have two sort of technology type questions or comments, and one that struck me, District Attorney Peters, was a comment you made about parents really sort of just want to be friends with their kids now, which could not be completely accurate. I have a bunch of kids. I think I'm only second to Josh with the number of kids I have, with his 8, but as my kids were growing up, sort of that's when cell phones came, and I just was amazed at the number of cell phones handed out to 10, 11, 12-year-olds, and it seems to be complementary with the same age that these kids are getting into trafficking, 11 years old, 12 years old. And so this is more of a comment. And that is the number of good people, good friends that I had that said, yep, you know what, Johnny he's on his phone all night. He's on his phone till 3 a.m. He's on his phone till 4 a.m. He's 11 years old. Take his phone. What's he going to sleep with a phone or a computer for? Get it out of the bedroom. So I think we need to educate parents, as silly as it sounds, to take the phones away from an 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old at 9 at night or at bedtime. It is insane. And it's an epidemic. Related to that, somewhere technology, and we've had a rash of suicides in central Pennsylvania of 14, 15-year-old girls for the most part. When that happens, does the DA or the AG, do you have the ability to take that child's phone, legally to take a phone and look at it and see what their communication has been over the last 6 months? Are you able to do that?
If there is a crime or suspicion of a crime, we would get a search warrant to do that. However, even if that's not the case, the parents certainly want to know what happened. And oftentimes it's the parent who is paying the bill, and therefore they control the account and can get into that. That phone is like giving the keys to your child's bedroom to a predator. And you tell parents that, coupled with don't be their friend, because every parent wants to be their friend. And the data, when I was at the White House, we did studies longitudinally. And the data shows that while at the time your child wants $20 to go to the movie or wants to stay out 2 hours later, they want you to be their friend, that in the end, when they're adults and they look back, all they ever wanted was for you to be their parent. So being a parent, not a friend, coupled with controlling that phone, because it is the phone it is the tool, but it's the internet and social media that's the force multiplier, which is why I've sued social media, because that social media brings everything together, brings depression, adolescence, as I mentioned earlier, curiosity, bullying, vaping, wanting to be popular. And when it all collapses and the bullying continues and the sadness perpetuates, when I was a kid and you got bullied, and I got bullied, I mean, look at me, it ended at 3 o'clock when you went home. Now it follows you home through that phone and the internet, and oftentimes the end of the road is suicide.
All right, thank you. And thank you very much. A follow-up on that. When a child becomes an adult, when a child is now 18 years old, and the same thing happens, there's a suicide or a drug overdose, it is my understanding for an 18-year-old that the parents cannot get access unless they're paying that bill. Is that accurate? And I would love to see somebody, I've had friends who have adult children that have died from drug overdose, and I know we're going off base a little bit here, but I would love to see policies where, gosh, the parents can get a hold of that phone of their 18, 19, 30-year-old and see who the last people were that they were, connected with before a suicide or a homicide. So your thoughts on that? And I apologize, Chairman, for going off the rails just a little bit.
No, because suicide is often the end result of a child who's been trafficked. If they see no way out. The problem with what you propose, and while I would love to see that, is something called the First Amendment. It's a liberty to which we cling, and we should, but I think there's some middle ground, and maybe legislatively, between the 302 laws and federal and state laws, and working with the internet providers. I mean, I can remember fighting with the providers when they didn't want to let us get into phones, and they intentionally arrayed their phones so that even they couldn't decrypt them and get in there as a selling point and a way to get them off the hook. But it's something that we need to look at. One of the things we can do, even in a small county, is to have a team. And the way we build teams to look at children who have been victims of sexual abuse, the multidisciplinary investigative teams where you bring all the brains together. We can do that with suicides or attempted suicides, overdoses, attempted overdoses. It gives us 2 bites at the apple. If you have a team that responds, and it's a cop and it's a coroner, sadly, but it's also other professionals, on the law enforcement side, you might have enough evidence at that scene, which looks like, sadly, a suicide only, where you can bring a drug delivery resulting in a death charge for the person who sold that drug to that person. And at the same time, if you have the social services there, you can carry the family, not only get information as to what happened, but carry the family forward out of that.
All right, thank you. Thank you all, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Starr.
Thank you, Chairman. I had a couple questions. I don't know. I know you work with the NGOs for child trafficking and stuff like that. You know, we have lost children. It's reported in the news that with the open borders and policies that the government has lost 80, that's a low number, to 320,000 children. Where are they and where are they being put? You know, we have no idea where these children are. Are they going into the traffic system?
So
Don't all jump on it at once, okay?
I know it's just
Yeah.
Go ahead, Heather. She's my boss. Anyways.
Okay, here.
So, yeah, you're right. We are all avoiding that question. I think the way I would like to address that is by saying we probably don't know the answer to that. However, I would like to focus on, and I think it may have been on the first panel, where one of the members brought up the fact that there's a lot of adults being trafficked, and I don't say that to mean in any way to take away from the seriousness of children,
Right.
But that's publicized and talked about an awful lot. Our focus has been at the AG's office to focus on these cases with young adults or adults, because there is a lot of attention given to the cases with children. I'm sure there's many children out there being trafficked. We all know that. But there's also a lot of young adults and adults being trafficked. The context in which we see children in a labor setting is oftentimes they're sent here by a family member. The family member has paid someone to smuggle them, which is, smuggling is a crime against a border, not a person. So, but they're paying someone to bring them here. The parent or the child then owe a debt to that person who brought them here and is forced to perform labor to pay off that debt. That's how we have been seeing this evolve, at least in Pennsylvania, through our experience. And again, this is, when you look at the crimes code, this is a relatively new crime and statute. The conduct isn't new. Human trafficking has been going on forever. But I say that to say that that's what we have been seeing in our cases in the Commonwealth.
Well, I'm just concerned because we know it's happening, and why aren't we tracking them? Why are we not tracking them from the border, and they are coming to Pennsylvania? Why are we not doing something to track them and find out where are these individuals, who has them? We hear the stories about them recycling at the border, where a child will come through with a young adult, and then he goes back to the, why are we not stopping some of this behavior? Another question I had was, we know the media is normalizing pedophilia, and they're coming after our most vulnerable. What are we doing to kind of curb that? We certainly don't want to exploit any certain gender or people who identify as a gender or sexuality or whatever like that. But, certainly we can see the vulnerability of young children with the perpetrators coming through with the media normalizing, like this is okay for young girls to be dressed up like little sex kittens and stuff like that. Are we doing anything as a government to kind of curb some of these ideas?
I would think that question probably relates back to the conversations that DA Peters had regarding phones, because I think you're referring to content and children on phones and seeing these things on phones, and that is not the area in which I specialize, but I can say that it is intimately related to a grooming process that traffickers
Right, I was
always
talking
have.
more with
Yeah.
Gabriel's, comments with Mr. Nassar, Larry. that, it was normal for those girls to go in there and be molested by him. It was the norm. That's disturbing to me. Yeah. Thank you.
Representative Stender.
Thank you for the information so far, and I think my question is more for the Attorney General's office. Are we seeing areas in the state that I have parts of Northumberland, Montour County. So is there areas of the state where I could, whether it be my children and youth, my local law enforcement, where they're really at the forefront of this issue? Like where they're getting it right, or is there a better resource from the state? Now, I know I was just on the AG's website the other day, but I was looking for stuff about stolen identity for seniors. So I wasn't sure if is there good resources there that we could be, maybe if people have questions that we can be funneling them to. Do you guys know? Lancaster County.
So the one thing I will say is there was recently a grant awarded by the PCCD to develop a website, a statewide website that would be available to the public that would provide education relating to both sex and labor trafficking. It's being worked on as we speak. Both Agent Fabian and I are members of the panel. As far as working together, I mean, that's something that we are doing and trying to increase within the Attorney General's office. I will say that this particular, I've worked on many different kind of cases throughout my career, but I have seen collaboration through state, local, federal agencies when it comes to this crime like no other. And I'll also say that as far as NGOs working with law enforcement to combat this crime like I've never seen before.
And then my other question is, just because I do have one in my district, do you guys utilize the child advocacy centers to help when dealing with, maybe victims or survivors?
Yeah, absolutely. Best practice is if you have a victim of a crime that is a minor, you would get them a forensic interview. And often we utilize the CACs. Sometimes our federal partners will have their own forensic interviewers that are mobile. So just from like a standpoint of like ease of like the interview, sometimes they're out in the field. But frequently we are collaborating with the CACs, and they're amazing.
All right. I think I just have a series of questions, and I think everyone else is good, but if someone else has a question off of this, you can obviously let me know. I feel like I'm getting old, and the reason I feel like I'm getting old is because when you talk about kids and the things that they're doing on phones, and first off, Representative Flick, I'm with you. My poor kids, they will never be getting a phone that I pay for, and I've told them that. First off, I can't afford it with having 8 children, but secondly, it's just there's so many different pitfalls associated with it, and I tell them if you want to go work and have a job, and obviously it'd have to be a legitimate job, but then have at it. But I have trouble understanding how this is so expansive in the United States of America. I'm just going through it. Just a couple of weeks ago, my brother and I were having just kind of a fun, not argument, but debate back and forth, actually on a theological issue. And there was a meme on Twitter that was making a point that I was making about a historical event from 400 years ago. And so I copied the meme, and I texted it to my brother and another friend. And sure enough, my entire feed became these Reformation type of debates that were happening with Catholicism and all these other things. What is going on? My entire feed used to be all about polling and about politics and news and stuff like that, but now all of a sudden it's about this religious discourse. And I just came to the conclusion that I have a digital footprint. And when I went to Alaska, I drove to Alaska with my 4 oldest kids and my father, and we were booking spots in Denali and along the way. And as soon as I'd go on Google, the advertisements would come up for Banff or for Jasper or for whatever was going on in the actual state of Alaska. I clearly have a digital footprint. How can somebody post something online and just not get caught? I don't understand it. Somebody somewhere knows, whether it's through artificial intelligence, whether it's through whatever tracking abilities that these platforms have, what's going on. And they're either not doing anything about it, or they can't do anything about it, or it's not marketable to do anything about it. I don't know. I don't know the answer, and I feel naive about that situation. But I'm having a hard time understanding how this isn't like shooting fish in a barrel, finding these perpetrators online. And you talk about a market for it and demand, and the victim. But the people that are the producers of it, is there some sort of roadblock that's in the way from whether it's the state or the federal government that is preventing law enforcement from actually pursuing these instances in an effective manner?
Sure. Excellent point, and you reminded me of that saying I think we've all heard, like, if it's free, then you're the product, right? Because we all have that. We all have like the free apps and the free email, but nothing is free. Like, you've become the product. Like, it's your information, your data that is being compiled and then sold for Banff ads, or stay at this hotel, or eat at this restaurant. I want to answer your question as concisely and directly as possible, but it's a really good question. And I think you almost have the answer in your own question. All three might be possible. It's not in the interests of big business to do it. They also can't. And then there's also Fourth Amendment protections that prevent the government from wholesale knowing the private access and the private messages that people would have in the content of communication. So like, it's kind of a trifecta. And then on top of that, technology will always outpace law enforcement and will always outpace, rules and regulations. Basically, for every advance that we make in computer forensics, reviewing phones or computers, there's going to be a company, and nowadays it can be an international company, that will develop an encryption software that's even stronger, or a VPN service to make it so that the communications can't be decoded, or will hide your location so that even if we know this person is a bad guy and they're doing the bad thing, we don't know who they are or where they are because they're using a VPN service, which I can explain all of that if you want, but kind of just like bird's eye view. Technology is outpacing law enforcement, and that will always be the case. So that is stacked against us. On top of that, I don't think it's in the interest in business to assist us in their business model. They exist as a self-serving entity to be profitable, not to help us do our jobs. And then on top of that, we have to operate within, the rules and guidelines of, we need to establish that there is a crime and then write search warrants so that we can get in and have access to the contents of certain things.
So as it relates to privacy, the question of privacy, and I appreciate what you're saying there. I've just always operated under the assumption that, especially social media, but the internet in general, is a public marketplace. I don't. Is it treated differently, I guess, from a legal standpoint? Is there a right to privacy of what you're doing on the internet?
I think, you're the attorney. You would probably better answer.
I think maybe if I'm understanding the question properly, the issue comes in is, if you see something on the internet, we then have to prove where is it coming from. And that's what Agent Fabian, I think, was getting at in terms of the process by which we would need to do that in law enforcement. You know, when you're seeing things online, someone who's posting something that they don't want others to know they're posting, they're not going to put the real name. They're not going to, we need to go through the steps to figure out who is actually doing the posting. But in addition to that, a lot of the things on the internet that are relevant to our cases are a lot more subtle. We're talking about exploitation of children online when we're talking about the different things that children are doing online. But more oftentimes, the kind of cases that we're working are traffickers recruiting victims. And it's not necessarily to perform sex acts online. It's through, you know, we had a case where there was a trafficker posting pictures of a girl with money like flying around her head and her crying, basically saying, do you need someone to be your pimp? Do you need money? So it's a recruitment tactic as well. And that trafficker isn't going to put anything easily attainable for law enforcement to track him. So we then have to go through all of those steps, which would be court orders, search warrants. The judges need to be involved. So it's a long process because of our constitutional protections in the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment. So it's not, it sounds like a great idea, and I'd love it if we could just look at that and figure out who it was and go. But then that also leads into the resource issue that we've talked about.
And it was noted earlier that these video, and I'm focusing on, and I understand it's broader than just being on the internet. I'm having a hard time getting through this particular aspect of it. I understand that it is more than that, but it was noted earlier that this stuff is on Twitter or X, on Instagram. Now, I've never been on Instagram or TikTok. That's how unsophisticated I am in all of this. And I'm assuming Facebook as well. Is there's some content there, and Twitter's the one that I'm on the most, and I scroll through Twitter to check my news and check on religious debates now, I guess, too. But I have never run through anything that I would look at and say, oh my goodness, like this is an issue. So I'm assuming, and I don't want to get too far into details on this because it scares the heck out of me, frankly. I'm assuming, though, in order to find this stuff, you have to search for this stuff. And so if you're searching, that search is traceable. And if it's traceable, then is that accurate? Is that how you would go about doing it? Or is there like a secret? I know people talk about the dark web, and I have no idea what the dark web is. Like, that's just a whole nother over my head situation. But is it just out there like any other consumable information on these platforms, or is there some trick that we don't want to talk about publicly, but that's out there that people use to find it?
If I may, Mr. Chairman, there are those tricks that we won't talk about publicly. They're not really tricks, they're techniques and legal and appropriate techniques. But back to your analogy, it's a marketplace, so why, if it's that prolific and that out there, why aren't we seeing it and able to easily take care of it? I liken it to a hotel or a farmer's market. Yeah, it's a marketplace, anybody can enter, but when you go into the hotel, the action is in the specific rooms, and people own those rooms, and people control their access to those rooms. So there's this nuanced approach on the internet for those that are interested in prostitution, interested in human trafficking, who know where to go, know how to look, know what to say, that eventually allows them entree into a specific room or group chat or app where these services are provided. And then relative to law enforcement, the individual owns the key to that room. Law enforcement can't go in unless we get a search warrant, probable cause, and develop all that we need to do. On top of which all of this stuff is laundered through fake IP addresses and fake companies. So while it's out there and obvious for us in law enforcement, getting there is the problem and what takes the time and complexity.
So I just want to jump in on that. So when it comes to drugs and things like that, I mean, we do sting operations, undercover things, operations to take down rings of individuals. You know, is there a similar process that takes place in the law enforcement world when it comes to human trafficking? And maybe you can't talk about that, and that's fine too. But I know it seems like we put a ton of time and energy in on the drug side, that because we're all aware of those, you know, plainclothes officers, things like that. But is that happening to the extent that it should be or could be when it comes to human trafficking? Is that something that we need to take a look at as policymakers and say, hey, we should be investing more in this to try to get in those, to use your analogy, into those spaces on the internet, that so that we can, our law enforcement officers have the ability to take down these.
The answer is
criminals.
yes, and yes. But we need to do more and we need to do better. If we had more task forces, if we took the lessons that we have learned from going after the mafia, it's an organized criminal enterprise. And how do you go after it? You don't just do the one-offs, you'll never get there. You can't even take the head off because someone else in the hierarchy is going to move up. You have to take the whole criminal enterprise, you have to cripple it, you have to take the money, you have to remove the incentive of the money, because that's why people are in business. So what do? You do consensuals, you do wiretapping, you pull financial records, you do surveillance, you do all of the things that have been successful with other organizations. It's just that now this is different from the mob or a drug cartel or a street gang, because the chattel is a human being. The evidence was said earlier is a human being, but the techniques still work. It's just that we haven't gotten law enforcement as a group to recognize that this is the new frontier, that this is the new horizon. So let's use everything that has worked for us before, and let's, just like everybody knows what a drug task force is, we need to get to the point where everybody knows what a human trafficking task force is, and we need the funding to be able to do that.
If I may just piggyback on that for just a second, having done organized crime cases for most of my career, that's how I started working these cases. We charged cases through the AG's office under the corrupt organization statute prior to the newer 2014 law, because we didn't have a usable human trafficking statute. And it's very successful for a lot of reasons. We've utilized wiretaps. However, the only thing I would add to what DA Peters said is that we're still having that demand. So if we take down an organization, send those traffickers to jail for life, we still have that demand. So someone else, like in a drug case, is going to step in. Somebody else gets on the corner, someone else is going to get online and buy that woman, girl, man, boy online, because someone's going to step in and take that over. And that's why I mentioned in my remarks that I think the demand is very important to focus on, because there's not much of an incentive for someone not to keep buying sex when they're going to be charged with a summary or a misdemeanor. It's just not much happens to them. That I think the prostitution law needs to be revamped and needs to be moved into Chapter 30, which is crimes against persons. That's where that belongs. And as far as doing these operations or stings, I think they're being done, and I think a lot of them are being done properly. But we need to learn from some of our mistakes in the past and be more consistent with how we do this throughout the state. And one way to do that would be to focus on the buyers, not focus on the potential victim or the person selling the sex, and look deeper into who is actually selling that young woman or young man. And they're probably not doing it on their own, and you're not going to open the door and go in there, and they're not going to say, please help me, please rescue me. That's not how it works. And that's where all these techniques come in to build a bigger case. But we need the resources to do it more, and we need the collaboration to do it properly.
All right. Any other questions? Well, I truly appreciate you all coming here today. This was an eye-opening testimony, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. On behalf of my constituents, my family, thank you for what you're doing. It's important work. Representative Ouellette, if you'd like to give a brief closing remark, then I'll finish this out.
Yep, I appreciate everybody's testimony. It really means a lot. This is a heavy topic. We knew it was going to be, and we know that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we appreciate the work that's being done, but we do have more to do. And you've helped us along in that process today, so this was valuable for your time, is valuable for us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for coming out here today to do this, and look forward to any additional policy initiatives. And as the community members that are here look to engage at this at a higher level as well, please know that all of us here are trying to work with you on that, and we want to make sure that we're protecting our families and our kids and those that are being abused in such heinous crimes. Just also want to thank Three Springs again for hosting us today. They're doing lunch here in a few minutes, so make sure you stick around for lunch. We do one of the neat things about what they're doing here is they have the One Life program, and it's a gap year program for students right out of high school, and they are doing their best to help educate these kids before they head out into the world about what's going on out there, so that they can be best equipped to be able to identify and help people through challenges such as human trafficking and any number of different things. So thank you for the work that you're doing there. That's one of the pieces of the community aspect of this that's very important, because this is going to be all of us working together, not just one group here and there. So I appreciate Three Springs for the work that they're doing, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity.
Thank you. And it is indeed a crazy and scary world that our children are growing up in, and the effort and the investment that you all have made and others in law enforcement have made is very much appreciated, and we want to make sure that we are assisting every which way we possibly can to ensure that you all have the resources and the tools, whether it's changing laws or funding, that our doors are open to you, so that you can do the good work that you are doing and continue to do. So thank you for the efforts you have put in and what you're going to be putting in going forward. The next policy committee hearing takes place tomorrow, September 20th, in Pike County. We'll be discussing tourism in Pennsylvania. Until